Hey guys, welcome back for today's lecture on Tuesday, May 5th, Cinco de Mayo. Um, we're getting pretty close to the end. I think we may finish the lecture tomorrow, either tomorrow or Thursday. Um, Either way, we're getting close. I'll talk at our Zoom meeting on Thursday about what our plan is. Um, it won't be anything big, but there will be a final assignment, and after that we will be good for the year. Yesterday uh, we talked about, we talked about Afghanistan, the Soviet Vietnam, and we talked about the Solidarity Movement, which was the beginning of the implosion of the Soviet Union. But it still takes time, and we still have some things to cover in that time. Now, today I'm going to start the lecture by showing you the essential question. I think maybe that would um, help you know what to look for necessarily. Not that this is more important than any of the other notes or anything else we'll talk about today, but uh, I can understand why, if some people have gone to the end of previous lectures to get the questions, that way they know they have it and they know what to catch. So I'm going to go ahead and start today's lecture with this. Um, and if you need to, you could pause right now, go to Classroom, type this question out, and have it ready to go. The question is going to be, what were Gorbachev's two biggest changes to government in the Soviet Union? And then define them. Now, again, you're not going to have any idea who Gorbachev is. Not yet. You will by the end of this lecture. Um, and you may think that's kind of vague. What two biggest changes? It'll be obvious. We're going to talk about two specific differences that he started when he took over power in the Soviet Union. And then want you to give the definition. I give you the definition, and it's very simple and it's very short. They're sentence fragments. They're not even a full sentence. So include all that. Uh, should be a simple question and answer. So we pick up in 1983 with the Star Wars initiative. Now this is very soon after. I don't know if it's the first Star Wars or what. I have never watched any of the movies. Um, but President Reagan outlines a plan that was known as the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, or as they called it, Star Wars. And they called it Star Wars for a couple reasons. Now, what the SDI was, it was a plan to put lasers up in space, and they would have an eye on Soviet missiles. And if any of those missiles were ever shot, or any of those missiles were ever deployed by the Soviet Union, then these lasers would shoot them immediately, causing the nuclear reaction to take place in the Soviet Union and not harm the US. Now, remember, this is 14 years after after we landed on the moon. So we were still pretty new in space and still learning about it, but we still had these big ideas, and we still had these dreams to accomplish. So this is called Star Wars for one reason being, well, it's literally up in space. Like, now we have now expanded nuclear warfare out of our own atmosphere, like out of our own planet. This concept, anyways. Um, so it could literally turn into Star Wars. Now, looking back at this plan, we call it Star Wars because its actual effectiveness was just as improbable as the actual movie Star Wars being based on a true story. Like at the time, we thought, man, what if we continue with this technological revolution, and what if we really build up to the point to where we can do this? And then after a while, we realized, oh yeah, that's ridiculously impossible. We're not going to be able to put lasers up in space, and we're not going to be able to uh, monitor everything the Soviet Union does and then be able to shoot that laser. First of all, space has no atmosphere. So shooting a laser, it's not going to just travel straight through in a direct fashion like it would through air. There's no telling what impact that nothingness would have. Plus, you can't really keep something in space in with no motion. No, there's no throwing it in park or throwing out the anchor in space. Like you're either constantly floating around or you're being propelled, like a space shuttle is. So there's constant movement, and it's not likely to be able to focus a laser on something through constant movement. Now, no one at the time knew this, or people were skeptical, but the possibility was still there at the time, and the Soviets heard about this, and they were terrified of it. They accused the U.S. of violating the 1972 Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which was a treaty signed, obviously, in 1972, that limited both countries to two anti-ballistic missiles, which I won't get into what those really are because I don't fully understand it. But they are missiles, obviously. And that's the extent that I know of it. But this concept was possibly threatening that. But the Soviets couldn't just sit back and say, well, that'll never work. Because for all anyone knew, maybe, just maybe, it would work. So the Soviets, despite already having a crumbling economy, because that's what happens in communism, it gets worse. Think back to when we first learned about communism, and I explained how if everybody's getting the same exact pay, then there's no incentive or no motivation to work hard or to work more. And then what happens when everybody stops working hard or stops working? Then everything's negatively affected. There's less food, there's less materials, there's worse materials, and then everybody suffers. Well, after 60 years of this communist economy, it was wearing thin. And so they were nearing economic collapse already, but they felt threatened. So they're like, well, we've got to spend money to counter this. So they continue to build up their nuclear arsenal and spend tons of money on it, despite the fact they didn't have any. And it just furthers their economic demise. Now, in 1985, a new leader of the Soviet Union comes to power, and his name is Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev is very different from every other Soviet leader. He is not the typical crazy and mean and intimidating leader that his predecessors were. Gorbachev comes from a very modest upbringing. Like he was born to peasant farmers. He joins the Communist Party and he rises through the ranks and waits his turn, and it finally comes in 1985. But when Gorbachev comes to power, he realizes that the Soviet Union is so damaged and the people are poor, they're sick, they're hungry, and they're just morale is at an all-time low. Like they're just completely worn out. So Gorbachev wants to reform the Soviet Union. So he issues in a policy known as perestroika, which was his idea to reform the economy, to restructure the economy. Basically, he was going to take away some of the government's power in the economy. Because when the government tells you how much to pay your employers or employees, and when the government tells you how much of something to make, and when the government tells you what to make and how much to charge, that's not an efficient market. That involves no supply and demand. And any success in economics requires supply and demand. And so he decided, well, let's just take government a little, not fully out, but let's loosen the reins a little bit. Let's allow businesses to call some of the shots. Let them decide how much of something to make. Let them kind of decide a price range. And it's a move towards capitalism, and it was a decent idea, but it comes about 40 years too late. The damage was done. There was no coming back from this. Now, his second reform idea was a policy known as glasnost. This was more of a social policy, and glasnost directly translates to openness. He was going to lift some of the oppressions on the people, specifically things like restricting of media and restricting of free speech. He was going to allow people the freedom of expression and to even openly criticize the Soviet Union and its government. That had never been allowed since the Soviet Union was created. If anybody said anything crosswise about the Soviet Union, they were executed. But Gorbachev was different. He was sympathetic to the people because he was one of the people. He wasn't a party machine. He wasn't a political party machine, a drone that just, spent his entire life being a yes man for the government. He was a commoner that rose to power. And he was going to use this as a step in the right direction. I'm not saying Gorbachev was a pushover and soft. Like he was still firm, and he was still had his Soviet ticks about him, but he was definitely more even keeled and calm, and he actually becomes very, very close friends with the United States president at the time, Ronald Reagan, which, to think 23 years before this, the leaders of the two countries, and Kennedy and Khrushchev, were hated enemies. A few years later, they become friends. Now that there's some bumps in the road, like there's still some huge differences in beliefs, but he's making steps in the right direction. Now, that's a picture of Gorbachev up there, and you might be able to tell, and this isn't really important, but I've always found it interesting. He has a birthmark on the top of his head. It looks like a blood stain. It looks like someone beat him over the head and he's starting to bleed, but it's a birthmark that he always had. And he caught a lot of flack for it, like around the world. That was kind of a joke around the world. But yeah, in case you looked at that picture and thought he had a map of South America up on his dome, no, it's a birthmark. So we'll stop there today. That's a pretty quick lecture, but we'll be all right. So if you need to go back to the beginning, get the question or the essential question, you can do that. But we'll call her good there. And we're getting close, guys, real close. Only a couple more days. We'll get this all taken care of. And we will go into summer and hopefully get out of quarantine here in the next couple weeks. So if you guys have any questions, email me. Take care, everybody.